Car Yang, on March 17, 2011, her 7-week-old daughter, Mirabelle Tao, died in circumstances that defied comprehension. Car was a mother of 4, living with her husband and children in a quiet suburban neighborhood. She had no criminal history. Friends and family described her as gentle, soft-spoken, and devoted. Born in 1981 into the Hmong American community, Car worked at an architectural firm, balancing career and home life. Outwardly, there were no warning signs, but Car carried a long battle with epilepsy, a condition she had struggled with since her teens. Frequent seizures left her disoriented, detached from reality, and fearful of her own mind. It was this medical history her defense would later cling to as the explanation for tragedy. That March afternoon, Car was reportedly alone with Mirabelle for just 11 minutes. Yet in that span of time, the baby's life was taken. When questioned by investigators, Car initially claimed she had blacked out while holding her infant near a space heater, but medical evidence quickly cast doubt. There were no burns on Mirabelle's clothing, no signs of external fire. Instead, detectives discovered the unthinkable: Mirabelle's pacifier inside the microwave. Confronted, Car shifted her story. She suggested she might have another personality. Then finally, she admitted she had placed her daughter inside the microwave and turned it on. The trial became a painful examination of intention versus illness. Prosecutors argued that Car acted deliberately, frustrated by a fussy infant, and that she saw her child as an obstacle to work and routine. Forensic experts testified to thermal injuries, internal damage to the baby's organs consistent with microwave exposure. These injuries, they said, could not have been caused by any heater. Kay's defense argued the opposite, that she had experienced a post-seizure state of confusion, a blackout that left her unaware of her actions. But no medical expert could firmly support such a claim. After 3 weeks of testimony and 1 day of jury deliberation, Car Yang was found guilty of first-degree murder and assault on a child causing great bodily injury. In December 2015, she was sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. Her 3 surviving children were placed with relatives. Family members spoke of a woman they believed had snapped under the weight of illness and circumstance. Prosecutors called her actions deliberate. The truth, perhaps, lives in the unbearable space between, the frailty of the human mind and the permanence of its consequences. Sandi Nieves. Sandi was 34 years old when she committed a crime that left California stunned. On the night of June 30, 1998, she turned her own Santa Clarita home into a death trap, setting fire to it in an act prosecutors later described as calculated revenge. To the outside world, Sandi was a mother of 5, raising her children in a quiet suburb north of Los Angeles. She had the outward image of devotion, a woman clinging to family as her anchor. But beneath that facade, her life was unraveling. Financial hardship mounted, her marriage collapsed, custody battles consumed her. And in the background, her dreams of becoming a police officer slipped further from reach as job applications went unanswered. Friends described her as isolated, increasingly emotional, and desperate. And just days before the tragedy, she was served with papers that deepened the wound. Her estranged husband was moving to revoke adoption of her 3 older children, severing ties and financial responsibility. It was a devastating blow, one she seemed unable to recover from. On the night of the fire, Sandi orchestrated what seemed at first like an ordinary family moment. She told her children they would have a slumber party in the kitchen. She laid out sleeping bags for her daughters, Jacine, 5, Crystal, 7, Rachelle, 11, and Nicolette, 12. Their 14-year-old brother David joined them, unaware of what his mother was planning. As the children drifted into sleep, Sandi quietly poured gasoline across the floor. She struck a match and set the house ablaze. Within moments, thick, suffocating smoke filled the rooms. David, later the sole survivor, testified that his mother told them to stay put, even as the smoke grew unbearable. His sisters coughed, panicked, and struggled, but they were trapped. When firefighters arrived, it was too late. All 4 girls had died of smoke inhalation. Sandi herself was found unconscious and taken to the hospital. When she awoke, the reality of her actions caught up to her. Police arrested her the following day. The trial was agonizing. David's eyewitness account became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. He described her calm demeanor, her deliberate instructions not to flee, her refusal to let them escape. It painted a chilling picture of intent. Sandi was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder for her son, and arson. After a 3-month trial, the jury took just 1 day to deliberate. Their decision: death. The judge called her actions cold, calculated, and vicious. Sandi spoke only briefly at sentencing. "If I could take back time, if I had been smarter, we would have gotten out." But to prosecutors, jurors, and the grieving families, her words rang hollow. They saw little sign of remorse. Experts pointed to anger and despair as her motives, fueled by revenge, not only against her estranged husband, but against a system she believed had betrayed her. Her son David moved in with his father. He has never spoken to his mother again. The letters she sends from prison remain unread. Sandi Nieves became one of the few women sentenced to death in California, joining the state's most isolated prison wing. But no punishment, neither life imprisonment nor death, can erase the echo of 4 small lives extinguished in a single night. Diane Downs. Then there's Diane Downs, late 20s, a postal worker in Oregon. To some neighbors, she seemed energetic, even fun. To others, she was restless, reckless, always chasing something more. Married young, raising 3 kids, a daughter, another little girl named Cheryl, and a son, Danny. Outwardly, Diane played the part of a confident single mom, but beneath the surface, her life was chaos. By the early 1980s, prosecutors say she was obsessed with a man who didn't want children. Friends recalled she was fixated, determined to win him back no matter what. At the same time, her moods became more volatile, her choices more reckless, her resentment of motherhood more obvious. Later, psychological evaluations pointed to traits of narcissism and antisocial behavior, traits that left little room for empathy. Then came the night that shocked Oregon. Late one spring evening, Diane pulled up to the emergency entrance of a hospital. Her 3 children were in the car, shot at close range. She told police a shaggy-haired stranger on a rural road had tried to steal her car and opened fire when she refused. But detectives quickly grew suspicious. Diane seemed far too calm. The timeline didn't add up. Evidence inside the car contradicted her story. And then the most damning testimony of all, when her surviving daughter regained the strength to speak, she told investigators she had seen her mother pull the trigger. The stranger story was destroyed. A Lane County jury convicted Diane Downs of murder, attempted murder, and assault. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, plus extra years to make sure parole was nearly impossible. She even managed to escape once in the 1980s, but was captured and transferred to another prison out of state. She has been denied parole again, and officials still call her a danger. For decades, Diane has insisted she's innocent, but the courts, her children, and the public see it differently. Jurors accepted a chilling truth. She tried to kill her kids because they stood in the way of the life she wanted. And that's the heart of the story. A mother's first duty is to protect. Diane Downs chose herself. 1 child dead, 2 scarred forever. And a betrayal so deep, no sentence could ever truly measure it. Andrea Yates. A name that shook America. Andrea Pierre Yates was a 36-year-old former nurse living in Houston with her husband, a NASA engineer, and their 5 children. To friends and neighbors, she seemed gentle, quiet, and completely devoted to being a mother. But behind that picture-perfect image was a much darker reality. For years, Andrea battled crushing postpartum depression and terrifying episodes of psychosis. She had been hospitalized multiple times, had attempted suicide, and cycled through medications. Doctors were gravely concerned, not just for her, but for her children. One psychiatrist even warned her, do not have more kids. The risk of relapse was too high, but life didn't stop. And when Andrea's father died in the spring, her fragile mental state collapsed further. She withdrew, stopped taking her medication, and became obsessed with religious punishment. At one point, she even filled a bathtub, later admitting to police she had thought about drowning the children. Her doctors urged constant supervision. But on a June morning in the early 2000s, that watchful eye wasn't there. After her husband left for work, Andrea filled the bathtub once again. One by one, she drowned her 5 children, 7 years old, 5, 3, 2, and a baby only 6 months old. She then calmly called 911, phoned her husband, and laid the children's bodies together on a bed. Prosecutors later argued that arrangement showed chilling deliberation. Police arrived within minutes. Andrea confessed on the spot. At trial, prosecutors went after the death penalty. A jury instead gave her life in prison, but the case didn't end there. A star prosecution witness had lied on the stand. The conviction was overturned. In her retrial, Andrea was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Experts described her condition as a textbook case of postpartum psychosis, delusions, paranoia, and a mind so broken she could not grasp right from wrong. She was committed to a psychiatric hospital where she remains to this day. Andrea Yates's story became one of the most infamous examples of postpartum psychosis in American history. But no verdict, no label, can erase the truth. 5 children lost their lives, and that tragedy stands as a haunting reminder. When the warning signs are there, ignoring them is not just dangerous, it can be fatal. Lashaun Harris. She was only 23 years old when her story became one of San Francisco's most heartbreaking tragedies. A former certified nursing assistant, she was also the mother of 3 young boys. Family, friends, and neighbors described her as quiet, deeply religious, and devoted to her children. But beneath that exterior, Lashaun was unraveling, trapped in a battle with severe mental illness that the system failed to fully address. Born in 1982 in Oakland, California, she grew up in a difficult environment. At just 16, she became a mother, giving birth to her first son. Those close to her remembered her as shy, obedient, and not prone to trouble. As she entered adulthood, she worked hard to provide for her children. But by her early 20s, troubling signs emerged. Lashaun's behavior shifted: uncontrollable laughter, hallucinations, disturbing religious delusions. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and hospitalized multiple times between 2004 and 2005. Doctors prescribed medication, but without consistent follow-up care, her condition worsened. On October 19, 2005, Lashaun boarded a train with her 3 sons, 6-year-old Treshaun, 2-year-old Toronto Jr., and 16-month-old Joshua. They arrived at San Francisco's bustling Embarcadero waterfront. To passers-by, they looked like a family enjoying a day out. They shared hot dogs, strolled by the pier, and laughed together. But as the sun set, witnesses saw something chilling. Lashaun calmly began undressing her children near Pier 7. Her oldest son cried out, "No, Mommy, no." But she did not stop. One by one, she lifted her boys and dropped them into the San Francisco Bay. Toronto Jr.'s body was recovered hours later. The bodies of Treshaun and Joshua were never found. When police located Lashaun, she was pushing a stroller filled with her children's clothes. When asked where the boys were, she answered calmly, "They're with their father." She later told investigators she believed God had commanded her to send her children to heaven. Crayon-colored letters she had written to her sons asked how heaven was and whether they were doing well. Her demeanor was eerily calm, disconnected, as though she truly believed what she had done was righteous. Lashaun was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. At trial, her attorneys argued she was legally insane, consumed by untreated schizophrenia. Prosecutors countered that she still knew the difference between right and wrong. The jury convicted her of second-degree murder, but the judge later declared her criminally insane, sentencing her to 25 years to life in a psychiatric facility rather than a prison. Experts confirmed she was deeply psychotic, experiencing auditory hallucinations and religious delusions so powerful that she believed she was carrying out divine orders. Her IQ was measured at 69, borderline intellectual disability. The court ruled that at the time of the crime, she lacked the capacity to understand the nature of her actions. Today, Lashaun remains in psychiatric custody. Those who have encountered her report she still writes letters to God and speaks of her sons as if they are alive, waiting for her in heaven. Her story is a haunting reminder not just of personal tragedy, but of systemic failure, a mother lost in untreated psychosis, children lost to the water, and a society left asking if more could have been done before the day she walked to the edge of Pier 7. Lashanda Wilder, in her early 30s, lived in the Milo Grogan neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. To most who knew her, she was quiet, guarded, and private. She rarely lingered in conversation and kept her life contained within the walls of her modest home where she raised her 3 sons. From the outside, her life appeared unremarkable: routine school days, quick errands, and family interactions that seemed typical. But behind the closed door of her house, tensions grew like storm clouds. Relatives and neighbors would later describe a household marked by volatility, control, and an atmosphere where stress hardened instead of softened. It was in that environment that her oldest son, 8-year-old Martonio, became the center of conflict. In late June of 2024, Lashanda made a call to the police. She reported her son missing, telling officers that she had last seen him when she put him to bed the night before. Police and volunteers poured into the neighborhood, searching yards, alleys, and blocks, while panic spread through the community. But the truth was much closer than anyone expected. Within hours, detectives discovered Martonio's body inside the house, hidden in a trash bag in the attic. The distance between Lashanda's public plea for help and the grim reality concealed just a staircase away was devastating. From there, the investigation moved quickly. Evidence was gathered, interviews conducted, phone records examined. Slowly, the picture filled in. This was not a sudden moment of rage, but a pattern of harshness and escalating control that culminated in fatal violence. Lashanda was arrested, and not alone. Her girlfriend at the time was also charged as a co-defendant. In a separate proceeding, she would admit her role in the boy's death. By mid-July of 2025, Lashanda stood in a Franklin County courtroom and changed her plea to guilty. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentence closed a grim chapter that began with a missing child call and ended with the revelation of a boy silenced in his own home. Prosecutors described Lashanda's actions as calculated, an attempt at control, followed by concealment once the consequences became irreversible. Medical reports cited findings consistent with asphyxiation and profound neglect, details that underscored the deliberate nature of the crime without the need for graphic description. The court concluded that while Lashanda faced pressures, she still understood right from wrong. Her guilty plea confirmed it, and her life sentence reflected society's judgment on the most unthinkable betrayal, a parent destroying the very life they were meant to protect. The public reaction was raw and immediate. Vigils were held for Martonio, candles lit the night. Relatives, broken by grief, spoke of a bright child who deserved safety and care. Even as the legal process unfolded, the truth remained simple and unchanging. A child was gone. His absence could not be repaired. And though the court's sentence ensured Lashanda Wilder would face consequences, the greater punishment was etched in the memory of a community, reminding all of what happens when cruelty takes the place of care. Christina Marie Riggs. Christina Marie Riggs was only 26 years old when her life, and the lives of her children, came to a devastating end. On November 5, 1997, police in Sherwood, Arkansas arrested her, just one day after she smothered her 2 young children in their beds. Riggs was a licensed practical nurse and a single mother. To friends, co-workers, and neighbors, she appeared polite, quiet, and deeply protective of her kids. But beneath that calm exterior, Christina was falling apart. She was emotionally drained, financially drowning, and silently battling a crushing depression that left her with little hope. Her story began in Oklahoma. Riggs grew up in a home marked by trauma. She would later claim that as a child she had been sexually abused by a stepbrother and even a neighbor, abuse that left scars she never truly escaped. By her teenage years, she turned to alcohol, marijuana, and relationships she admitted were desperate attempts to feel wanted. At just 16, she gave birth to her first child and placed the baby for adoption. She tried to rebuild. Riggs pursued a career in nursing, working hard to provide some stability. But her personal life continued to unravel. By the mid-1990s, she was divorced and left to raise her two children, 5-year-old Justin and 2-year-old Shelby, almost entirely on her own. Long work shifts, mounting bills, and constant exhaustion wore her down. Then came an arrest for writing bad checks, which only deepened her shame and stress. To her mother, she admitted she was just tired. But privately, Christina was forming a plan. She convinced herself that taking her children with her in death was an act of mercy, a way to protect them from abandonment and suffering. On the night of November 4th, 1997, Riggs carried out her plan. She gave Justin and Shelby small doses of a sedating antidepressant. Once they had drifted to sleep, she prepared a lethal injection. Her first attempt was with Justin. She injected him with potassium chloride, the same chemical used in state executions. She thought it would be quick and painless, but undiluted, the drug caused intense pain. Justin woke in agony, crying out. Desperate, Riggs gave him morphine to quiet the pain, but when it didn't work, she placed a pillow over his face until he no longer moved. With Shelby, she abandoned the injection and smothered her with a pillow directly. When it was done, Riggs gently laid her children side by side on her bed. She pulled a blanket over their small bodies and sat down to write suicide notes. In those letters, she explained her reasoning, expressed love for her children, and prepared to join them in death. She swallowed a lethal dose of pills and injected herself with potassium chloride, expecting not to wake again. But the next morning, her mother found her unconscious but alive. Christina was rushed to the hospital, revived, and then arrested as soon as she was stable. In court, Riggs pleaded not guilty by reason of mental illness. Her defense pointed to severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, arguing that her actions were born of mental collapse. But the prosecution countered that this was not a moment of madness. It was planned, deliberate, and selfish. They argued she saw her children as obstacles, as burdens too heavy to carry. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Their verdict, guilty on 2 counts of capital murder. But what shocked the courtroom came next. During sentencing, Christina told her attorneys not to present any mitigating evidence on her behalf. She looked directly at the jury and told them, "I want to die. I want to be with my babies." The jury granted her request. Riggs became the first woman executed in Arkansas in over 150 years. On May 2, 2000, Christina Riggs was executed by lethal injection. Her final words were filled with sorrow and resignation. "There is no way, no words to express how sorry I am. I love you, my babies." To the very end, she believed that death was her punishment and her only path to peace. Tierra Capri Gobble, a name remembered across Alabama for a crime so brutal that even seasoned detectives were shaken. She was just 21 years old at the time, young, unemployed, and already marked by a childhood of trauma, instability, and loss. She had no steady job, few meaningful relationships, and a reputation for being volatile. On the surface, Tierra seemed like a struggling young mother trying to rebuild. In reality, she was already known to child welfare authorities. By 21, she had given birth to multiple children. One by one, they were removed from her custody amid repeated allegations of neglect and abuse. Her infant son, Phoenix Cody Parrish, ended up in the care of her great-uncle, Edgar Parrish. The court had been clear Tierra was not to have access to Phoenix, and Edgar was not to leave the state with the child. But rules were broken. Edgar moved to Alabama, taking Phoenix with him, and soon allowed Tierra and her boyfriend to move into the home. That decision proved fatal. On the morning of December 15, 2004, tragedy struck. Tierra walked into Phoenix's room and found him unresponsive. She called a friend, Tori Jordan, who in turn alerted Edgar. Edgar dialed 911, but when paramedics arrived it was already too late. Baby Phoenix was gone. The autopsy results were devastating. Phoenix had suffered skull fractures, rib fractures, broken wrists, and signs of repeated trauma. Doctors testified that the injuries required immense force and would have caused unbearable pain. This was not a single accident. This was abuse. When questioned, Tierra gave shifting stories. At first, she said Phoenix had been fussy and hard to calm. She admitted she might have struck his head against the crib or squeezed him too tightly, but the evidence painted a far darker picture. Tori testified that Tierra had once said, "If I can't have my children, then no one will." Investigators also uncovered a handwritten letter. In it, Tierra wrote, "It's my fault my son died, but I didn't mean for it to happen." Those words sealed her fate. The jury found Tierra Gobble guilty of capital murder. The defense begged jurors to consider her abusive childhood, her mental health struggles, and the years of instability that had shaped her. But the prosecution emphasized the cruelty, the repeated trauma, and the helplessness of the victim. In the end, the jury voted 10-2 for the death penalty. On December 1, 2005, the judge upheld that recommendation. Tierra became one of the very few women on Alabama's death row. Psychological evaluations described her as emotionally unstable, scarred by trauma, and resentful toward the system that had taken her children away. But even those experts agreed this was not a sudden outburst of rage. This was prolonged abuse. The court used the harshest words it could: heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Words reserved for crimes that defy comprehension. And perhaps that is what makes this case linger, not just the horror of a baby's final moments, but the betrayal at its core. A mother is supposed to nurture and protect. Instead, Phoenix's life ended in pain, in the very place he should have been safest. "It's my fault," Tierra wrote. But was it only hers? Or does some fault also lie with every missed warning, every intervention that failed, every chance given that went nowhere? In the end, the justice system had its answer. Phoenix Cody Parish was gone, and Tierra Gobble would face the ultimate penalty. A child silenced, a family shattered, and a reminder that when Veronica Youngblood. Ms. Youngblood was a mother living in McLean, Virginia, in her late 30s at the time of sentencing. To those who passed her in the hallways of her apartment building or watched her quietly run errands with her daughters, she appeared reserved, guarded, even ordinary. Her life seemed built around the small circles of motherhood, school days, home routines, and moments in the community. But when the courtroom lights turned on her, a fuller portrait came into focus. Veronica's life began far away in Argentina, where she endured a childhood scarred by abuse, hardship, and neglect. She became a mother as a teenager, carrying the burdens of responsibility before she was fully grown herself. Years of struggle followed her into adulthood, and while she sought to build a stable life, the fractures from the past seemed to shadow her every step. By the time her marriage collapsed, the weight of divorce, financial strain, and a bitter custody battle were pulling her household apart. What neighbors saw as a calm exterior was in reality a tightening knot of anger, despair, and fear. In the weeks before the killings, prosecutors would later argue, the signs of planning began to surface. Veronica purchased a handgun just days before the tragedy. Investigators found search histories, dark, searching inquiries into ways to carry out an irreversible act. The spark, they claimed, was a looming court decision that would take one of her daughters to live with her ex-husband under a custody arrangement. Her defense painted another picture. They described a woman unraveling, her mental health collapsing, her mind spiraling into a place where death, hers and her children's, felt like the only answer. On an evening in August 2018, inside the family's McLean apartment, Veronica acted on her plan. She gave both of her daughters sleep aid gummies, then turned the weapon on them as they lay in bed. Her youngest, still in early childhood, was killed instantly. Her older daughter, a teenager, though gravely wounded, managed to summon the strength to dial 911. In a faint and broken voice, she told a dispatcher what had happened. That call became one of the central pieces of evidence the jury would later hear. Veronica did not flee. Hours later, police took her into custody. She spoke openly to detectives, acknowledging she had planned to kill both her children and herself. Her calm admission left investigators without doubt. The trial was both harrowing and meticulous. Prosecutors mapped the timeline with precision: the weapon purchase, the sedatives, the crime scene, and Veronica's statements. Her defense pleaded insanity, calling expert witnesses to describe trauma, depression, and psychosis. But the prosecution countered with the 911 recording, with the clarity of her confession, and with testimony that pointed to deliberate preparation. The jury deliberated and returned its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and of using a firearm in the commission of the crimes. The insanity defense was rejected. The weight of accountability fell squarely on her. At sentencing, the judge echoed the prosecutor's words: "No duty is more sacred than the duty of a parent to protect their children, and no betrayal cuts deeper than when that sacred trust is broken." In September 2023, Veronica Youngblood was sentenced to 78 years in prison, structured as consecutive terms for each child's death, along with additional years for the firearm charges. It was, in every way, a life sentence. News outlets across the region carried the same grim story. There would be no parole date, no eventual return. For the children's father, grief had no measure. He spoke of wounds beyond repair, of lives cut short by the very person meant to shield them. The defense called it collapse, a catastrophic breaking of a woman's mind. The prosecution called it revenge, deliberate, controlled, and unforgivable. Both narratives admitted suffering. Only one demanded accountability. And so the jury, and later the judge, answered with clarity: explanations may chart a path, but they cannot excuse the destination. 2 young girls with futures waiting to unfold were killed by the one person sworn to protect them. The sentence, measured not in years but in decades, stacked upon decades, is the law's firmest response to a betrayal beyond comprehension. Brandy Lee Rose. Devine. Brandy Lee Rose. Devine was only 25 years old when her name became a tragic reminder of neglect, addiction, and loss. A young mother of 4 living in Turlock, California, she resided in a small duplex on North Dane Avenue. To neighbors and those who only saw her in passing, Brandy seemed like countless other overwhelmed young mothers, trying to manage the chaos of raising children while carrying the private burdens of daily life. Her youngest daughter, Stephanie Torres, was a fragile child, born prematurely and living with cerebral palsy. Stephanie's condition demanded constant care, medications, therapy sessions, and hands-on guidance. Despite her challenges, she was making progress. Slowly but surely, Stephanie had begun to sit up on her own, crawl across the floor, and even feed herself with assistance. It was progress her doctors considered remarkable, progress that offered a small but bright glimpse of hope for her future. But in July of 2012, that fragile thread of hope snapped. Behind the closed doors of her modest home, Brandy had spiraled into drug use. Methamphetamine became her escape, her means of numbing the stress and weight of responsibility. According to authorities, she spent nearly 3 full days locked away in a drug-fueled haze. While she disappeared into that fog, Stephanie was left isolated in a back room, without food, without water, without medication, without comfort. The little girl was confined to her crib, surrounded by the family's cats, and utterly alone. On July 16, 2012, neighbors heard Brandy screaming. When help arrived, the scene was devastating. Stephanie lay unresponsive in her crib. Emergency responders tried desperately to revive her, but it was too late. An autopsy confirmed what investigators feared. Stephanie had died from dehydration and malnutrition. At nearly 3 years old, she weighed just 13 pounds, closer to the weight of a 1-year-old than a toddler on the verge of her 3rd birthday. The pathologist testified that her body bore unmistakable signs of prolonged neglect. The conditions inside the home told their own story. The air reeked of animal waste. Stephanie's room was cluttered with filth, her environment reduced to chaos. When questioned, Brandy admitted she had not even opened the door to her daughter's room since the prior Friday. Days had passed, and she had left her medically fragile child entirely alone. Brandy was arrested immediately and charged with second-degree murder, felony child cruelty, and drug use. At trial, her public defender argued that Brandy's negligence was not intentional, that she lacked the full understanding that her inaction could lead to death. But the jury disagreed. After less than an hour of deliberation, they found her guilty of murder. In December 2013, Brandy Lee Rose Devine stood before a judge and was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. In the courtroom, she offered an apology to her surviving children and accepted responsibility for Stephanie's death. But the silence was striking. No one spoke on Stephanie's behalf during the sentencing hearing. The quiet in that courtroom echoed the silence that had filled that small back room in her final days. Psychological assessments later described Brandy's mindset as one warped by substance abuse and denial. She told detectives that she believed her 6-year-old child could take care of Stephanie, a statement that revealed just how far from reality she had drifted. Whether her actions were the result of pure addiction, mental health struggles, or some fractured combination of both remains a matter of debate. What cannot be debated is the outcome. A little girl, vulnerable and full of potential, was lost, her life extinguished not in an instant, but over days of preventable neglect. Jessica Nicole Bradford Essica. Nicole Bradford was only 23 years old when her secret came crashing into public view. In November 2011, she was arrested for the murder of her newborn daughter, an act that stunned those who thought they knew her best. At the time, Bradford worked at the Julian Youth Academy in Whitmore, California, a private Christian boarding school for troubled teens. To staff and students, she seemed dependable, soft-spoken, and nurturing. She carried herself as a role model, someone who guided vulnerable young women through their struggles. But behind that image, Jessica was quietly hiding a crisis that would end in tragedy. Bradford's own story was complicated. She had been adopted as a child and raised in a conservative Christian household. Her faith was central to her life, and she often spoke about morality, purity, and the importance of living by biblical values. That identity became a burden when she discovered she was pregnant outside of marriage. Terrified of the judgment it would bring, she decided to keep her pregnancy a secret. No one knew, not her parents, not her co-workers, not even her longtime boyfriend. For months, she wore loose-fitting clothes, concealing the pregnancy as her due date drew closer. She told no one, all while continuing her job and daily routine, as if nothing had changed. On September 19, 2011, Bradford gave birth alone beneath a deck on the school campus. The baby girl, later named Lily, was alive, crying, and full term. But Jessica did not seek help. She did not take the infant to a hospital or even confide in a friend. Instead, she kept the baby hidden. For the next 4 days, Jessica fed Lily nothing more than tiny drops of water from her fingertip, no formula, no milk, no medical care. The baby slowly starved. Lily died in silence, her cries fading, until there were none left. For 7 weeks, Lily's body remained hidden. Bradford placed her daughter in a laundry basket and kept it inside her dorm room. Life went on. She worked her shifts, she laughed with colleagues, and no one suspected the truth. Surveillance footage even showed her shopping with her boyfriend, buying alcohol just hours after giving birth, while her newborn lay hidden nearby. It wasn't until co-workers went looking for a blanket that they discovered the basket. Inside, they found the remains of a baby so decomposed she had become mummified. They called authorities immediately. At first, Bradford insisted the baby had been stillborn, but as investigators pressed, the truth unraveled. She admitted Lily had been born alive. She admitted the baby had lived for several days, and she admitted she had done nothing. Out of fear of losing her job, fear of disappointing her parents, fear of shattering the image she had built, she chose silence. The case moved swiftly to trial. In June 2014, after just a day and a half of deliberation, a jury found Jessica Bradford guilty of first-degree murder. The prosecution argued that her choices were deliberate and premeditated, that she weighed her options and chose concealment. They pointed to her failure to seek any help, her ability to continue daily life as normal, and her chilling detachment. The defense painted a picture of a young woman paralyzed by fear, overwhelmed, and unsupported. But the jury was unmoved. Bradford was sentenced to life in prison. Psychological experts never gave a formal diagnosis, but prosecutors highlighted her emotional distance. She had not even given the child a name until after the autopsy forced her to acknowledge the baby's existence. In her own words, she admitted, "If I named her, it meant she was real." Jessica Bradford's story was not one of sudden violence or uncontrolled rage. It was quieter, colder. It was a story of denial, paralysis, and neglect that stretched over days until a helpless infant faded away. In the end, the tragedy lay not only in what Jessica did, but in everything she refused to do. And as the courtroom closed on her fate, one haunting question remained. How could someone trusted, admired, and looked up to by others become the architect of such a silent, secret, devastating loss? Carol Coronado, a name that still echoes in Los Angeles County when people talk about the darkest side of motherhood. She was a stay-at-home mother in her early 30s, living with her husband and their 3 little girls in a modest home near West Carson in the South Bay area. To anyone passing by, they were an ordinary family. A young couple struggling with bills, late nights, and the endless needs of infants and toddlers. Neighbors would later tell reporters that nothing seemed unusual, that the Coronados blended in like anyone else trying to make life work. But inside that small house, Carol's world was coming apart. Relatives described her as a devoted mother, but also as overwhelmed, emotionally exhausted, and sinking deeper into a fragile state of mind. They noticed her pulling away, becoming quieter, her once steady presence giving way to withdrawal. It was a change only recognized in hindsight, when the horror that followed gave every subtle detail a terrifying weight. In the weeks leading up to May 2014, questions about Carol's mental health grew louder. Some wondered if she was battling postpartum depression. Others feared it was something worse, postpartum psychosis, a rare but devastating disorder that can twist reality and drive delusion. After her arrest, psychiatric experts pointed to exhaustion, paranoia, and disorganized thinking. Her husband, shattered by what happened, publicly begged for people to see the truth as he saw it. Not a monster, but a woman whose mind had collapsed under unbearable strain. He wanted treatment, not punishment. But the law saw it differently. Prosecutors stood firm. They told the court that however troubled Carol might have been, she still understood her actions, and she carried them out with intent. That clash between medical interpretation and legal responsibility would shape the entire trial. On a late May afternoon in 2014, the tragedy unfolded. Inside the Coronado home, Carol killed her 3 daughters, a toddler, a baby barely over a year old, and an infant, her own children. No graphic detail is needed. The simple truth of who they were and what happened is enough to break the heart. The first alarm came from a neighbor. The children's father, working just across the street, rushed home in panic as sirens closed in. What first responders discovered inside left no doubt. 3 little girls gone and a mother in custody. Detectives gathered statements from family and neighbors. They documented the evidence in the home, traced the timeline, and prepared a case that moved quickly into the courtroom. By late November of 2015, the jury delivered its decision. Carol Coronado was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The case then entered its sanity phase, where the same jury was asked to decide whether Carol was legally sane when she committed the killings. Their verdict? Yes, she was. Jurors also found special circumstances, multiple victims, and the use of a knife. Those findings sealed her fate under California law, removing any possibility of parole. On February 15, 2016, Los Angeles Superior Court judge imposed the sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole, News outlets across Southern California covered the story, showing the grief-stricken father and family members processing the verdict. For them, no outcome could undo the loss, but the decision was final. The state would treat Carol Coronado not as a patient, but as a murderer. Her appeals that followed did not shake the original judgment. The conviction, the sanity finding, and the life without parole sentence all stood. And so the case remains a wrenching reference point whenever the question of postpartum mental illness and legal accountability arises. Defense experts had testified about symptoms of psychosis. The prosecution countered with the simple fact that she had acted deliberately, with understanding of right and wrong. The motive that jurors accepted was devastating in its simplicity, a mother in turmoil who crossed an irreversible line. Mental health explanations could describe her state of mind, but they could not erase the reality of choice. The court said she chose violence. And that is where this story closes. 3 children lost because the one person sworn to protect them became the source of harm. The life without parole sentence is not just punishment, it is a recognition of betrayal and a promise to society that crimes against the most defenseless will be met with the harshest judgment the law allows. Let their names, their faces, and their brief lives remain at the center of memory, long after the courtroom closed. Clover Boykin. After the arrest, she sat quietly in a Palm Beach County, Florida courtroom, her face unreadable, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was charged with the unthinkable, the murders of 2 infants, her own 5-month-old son, Dayton, and a 9-month-old girl named Kayla Basante, whom she had once babysat lovingly. The courtroom was silent, but the weight of betrayal was heavy. Clover's life had not followed a stable path. Born in January 1975, she grew up in an unstable household fractured by abandonment. Her father left when she was just 7 years old, and from then on, she was passed from one relative to another. Sometimes her mother, sometimes her grandmother, sometimes an aunt and uncle. There was no consistent parental presence, no steady anchor in her life. Those who knew Clover described her as quiet, reserved, someone who didn't cause trouble. She worked at a grocery store and later secured a job as a file clerk at a doctor's office. Outwardly, she seemed responsible and composed, but inside a storm brewed that few could see. On November 16, 1993, Clover was babysitting 9-month-old Kayla Basante. At some point during the day, Kayla was found unresponsive. She was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support, but days later, she died. The cause of death was unclear, and her passing was initially ruled accidental. The Basante family, stricken with grief, leaned on Clover for comfort. For nearly a year, she remained part of their lives. She mourned with them, attended gatherings, and even shared in their tears. But beneath her calm exterior, Clover was hiding a dark truth. Almost exactly a year later, tragedy struck again. On October 27, 1994, Clover's own infant son, Dayton, was found dead in her bedroom. Clover told her family that he had died from sudden infant death syndrome. But an autopsy revealed injuries inconsistent with SIDS. Detectives grew suspicious. When investigators brought Clover in for questioning, she broke down and confessed. Not only had she killed Dayton, but she also admitted that she had been responsible for Kayla's death the year before. Her confession stunned detectives. She explained that she had been haunted by recurring dreams, tormented by memories of childhood trauma, and overwhelmed by feelings of abandonment. She described one nightmare in which she mistook her son for her abusive father and lashed out violently. She said that in the case of Kayla, she acted in a moment of rage after feeling emotionally rejected by her boyfriend at the time. "I'm evil," she told detectives. She thanked them for stopping her, admitting she might have gone on to hurt others if they hadn't intervened. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as her words were read aloud. The legal outcome was swift and severe. Clover Boykin pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in Kayla's death and second-degree murder in Dayton's. She was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years before she would even be eligible for parole, plus an additional 40 years served concurrently. For the Basanti family, that sentence was not enough. They expressed outrage that parole was even an option. For them, the idea that she might one day walk free was unbearable. Psychological experts pointed to Clover's fractured childhood, her trauma, her desperate need for attention, and her emotional instability. They suggested her acts were born of untreated pain and mental illness, but to the families of the victims those explanations rang hollow. They saw her not as broken, but as manipulative. They pointed out that she mourned with them, pretended to comfort them, all while hiding her crimes. Today, Clover lives in protective custody. In prison, as in life, those who harm children are despised, even among the guilty. She is isolated from other inmates, shunned and reviled. She once said no one ever paid attention to her. Now, no one wants to. And in that silence, she must live with the echoes of two children, whose voices were silenced far too soon. Kelli Lynn Murphy. Hours earlier, she had made a quiet, chilling call to 911. Her voice was calm but hollow as she reported that she had tried to take her own life. When the dispatcher asked about her children, she delivered a single line that would haunt investigators and echo through the courtroom for years. They're in heaven now. That sentence marked the beginning of one of the darkest tragedies in Castle Rock's history. By all outward appearances, Kelli was the model of a devoted stay-at-home mother. She lived in a neatly kept suburban home and spent her days caring for her two children, Liam, 9 years old, and Madigan, 6. Friends remembered her as soft-spoken, attentive, and fiercely protective of her kids. Teachers at the local elementary school described her as the kind of parent who volunteered at events, checked homework, and seemed devoted to her children's growth. But behind those suburban walls, her world was unraveling. Kelli and her husband, Robert Eric Murphy, were locked in the middle of a bitter and increasingly hostile divorce. Their marriage had disintegrated into mutual accusations, restraining orders, and courtroom battles over custody. Kelli demanded sole custody. Robert fought for joint rights. The next morning, they were scheduled to appear in court to finalize temporary orders. Court records would later reveal a household poisoned by allegations and counter-allegations. Kelli claimed Robert had choked their daughter, had once pushed her head underwater, and had even barricaded Kelli in the basement during one of their arguments. Robert denied it all, insisting Kelli was fabricating stories to gain leverage in custody hearings. Regardless of the truth, what was undeniable was Kelli's declining mental health. Friends saw her becoming more isolated, overwhelmed, and erratic. On May 23, 2011, the unraveling reached its breaking point. In the early hours of the morning, while the house was silent, Kelli smothered Liam and Madigan in their beds. There were no signs of a struggle, no cries for help. Just two children tucked into their perfectly made beds, gone forever. When police arrived in response to her 911 call, they found Kelli with self-inflicted wounds to her wrists. She had consumed alcohol and pain medication in what appeared to be a suicide attempt. Yet she was alive, calm, detached, and asking for a lawyer. She repeated only that her children were in heaven. On the kitchen table, officers found a custody document covered in handwriting. In the margin, in bold letters, Kelli had scrawled, "Was it worth it?" Prosecutors would later argue those words were a direct message to her husband. The trial began in 2012. Kelli's defense attorneys argued that she had been in the middle of a mental health crisis, that she was impaired by alcohol and medication, and that she had not fully comprehended her actions. They painted a portrait of a desperate mother who intended to take her own life, but woke up in a nightmare she could not understand. Prosecutors told a very different story. They said Kelli was not confused but calculating, that she was determined to punish her husband in the most devastating way possible by taking from him what he loved most. Medical experts testified that smothering two children required time, intention, and awareness. This was not an impulsive act that happened in seconds, but a deliberate one. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. Their verdict, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. When the judge pronounced sentence, 2 consecutive life sentences without parole, Family members wept openly in the courtroom. The weight of the day was unbearable. It was Liam's birthday. He would have turned 11 years old. Instead, his family buried him. Experts could not agree on a single motivation. Some saw revenge, others saw untreated psychological collapse. The prosecution framed it as an attempt to maintain control. The defense insisted it was the act of a broken woman, but the result was the same. "Mothers give life," one prosecutor said in closing, but in this case, Kelli Murphy took it. And in the end, the question that lingered was one no courtroom could answer. What causes a loving mother to cross that final, irreversible line?